So, continuing in my investigation of Sapiens here, I had done a video on scientism, and honestly, this is something I should have done long ago when my mind worked better. But I put it forward as basically an argument that when he's talking about his ideologies and religion, which he expressed broadly in terms that includes the ideologies, that what I call scientism belongs there. Whatever you want to call the framework of beliefs that allow us to do science, to investigate in that particular manner. And I still think he's wrong, but I'd like to provide at least some of the discussions that he's given, because he never, I'm not sure why he doesn't equate the two, the ideologies with the background of the scientific method and whatever. And there are a lot of parallels, and they can get much worse. The only thing that I could find, I read his section on science, hoping that I would find something. And it's kind of interesting because the next thing is the capitalist creed, okay? Which to me seems like he's looking at capitalism as the same kind of ideology as he looks at socialism, Buddhism, and all the religions. In terms of whether they're deist or not doesn't really make a difference. In terms of a set of stories that we tell each other that allow us to, perform rules as to how we should lead our lives, etc. The only thing in the scientific section that I found that really dealt with this at all, well, there's a couple of pieces. One is, let's start with his first, the discovery of ignorance, is the idea that, we don't know everything that's important, okay? And that we can discover and find out things that are important. Through whatever means, okay? Now, I'm not sure that's entirely true. It is true, but I'm not sure that it's entirely true, his claim, which is that prior cultures and whatnot didn't have quite this same understanding. Obviously, the ancient Greeks, some of the philosophers certainly had that. And in a lot of ways, modern science is very closely related to the kind of work that they were doing, which was, outside of any kind of deist type ideological background. Although everybody lives in their own culture. And that's one of the problems when I use the term scientism. One of the problems is we're all living it. I don't care if you're whether you're a scientist or some other, humanistic type person, or if you're a fundamentalist in a religion. The truth of the matter is everybody in today's society is living under the realm of scientism, no matter what you do about it. There's nothing, there's not much you can do to avoid it, right? Are you going to deny that cell phones work? That's a different thing. That's technologism, I guess. But they're fairly closely related in that the findings of science, more or less, are what our technology are based on. There's certainly an expansion of a willingness to look at, to accept that we are ignorant in important things. But I think there was a reasonable willingness, even amongst your theologians, to say, look, I'm ignorant of this. It's just the source material that they would go to find their answers would be different, okay? And he does catch on one important thing, at least for the medieval era, which is that, I have trouble keeping these lit too when I'm talking, which is that there was certainly a period of time in which the majority of people the vast majority of people were willing to say, look, anything important would be in the Bible or in the original church fathers, or Muhammad would have spoken about it and it would have been commented on by later. But in a sense, all that commentary is a revision and a focusing of the lens to more and more specific aspects of that ideology, that religion, whatever you want to call it. And discovering problems because, like Aristotle, like Augustine, the really great thinkers quite often left some big gaps. They came up with a big idea, or several big ideas, but they kind of grind against each other and they don't quite fit, okay? And so that's one of the problems that, almost any theology or any philosophical school has to deal with, which is that broadly you may accept, and I don't know what you want to call that, but broadly you may accept some basic idea and everything is kind of built upon that. But then when you start looking at the individual pieces, and this is similar to games, when you start looking at the individual pieces and how they were laid out originally, they start causing some friction and some problems. And in the same way, when you're designing, a game, you work from a broad idea, but then when you get into the subsystems and you start trying to make them really detailed and explicit, then you start running into problems, right? In a very similar sort of way. As you dig deeper, you find discrepancies, and you're going to have to reconcile those, or possibly have to give up the entire basis of your ideology, as it were. Now, I'm not really worried as much about the book here. He goes into some key aspects, like that observation and mathematics are key to the scientific process in general. But the one chapter that really, really dealt with this problem is the scientific dogma. And what does he talk about here? Well, the first thing he says is modern science has no dogma. And immediately I say, bullshit. And then I'm willing to say, okay, this may be, again, a matter of semantics. He played the other one off as a matter of semantics. Maybe he'd play this one off as well. It depends on what you want to call dogma, right? But science, as it's practiced, is reliant on some very strong underlying beliefs. Things like, first of all, our observations reflect an underlying world. That's an important one, and one that, seems obvious to the lay observer, but we are programmed essentially for our own survival, as you would, to being able to interpret, these signals that come into our brain and come up with solutions that keep us in existence. If you take things on the, most basic kind of acceptable level. But beyond that, when you start looking at theories that, like, the universe is a simulation, or there's multiverses and they actually interact with one another, or shit like that, that becomes less and less apparent. And actually, the more you look at, how our brains interpret the data that comes into them, etc., again, it's focused just on what our survivability is. There's a lot of the underlying world we cannot see. For example, we don't see into the infrared or the ultraviolet with our eyes. We can create tools which see these things. But there's things that we can only postulate about, stuff like gravitons, that we don't even have evidence for, right? And the structure could be completely different. As it stands, the structure is already completely different from how we kind of perceive it. We think of things as objects, right? We think of, that's a tree, when the reality is that the material that makes that up is exchanged over the course of its life. And, I don't know how many times. With the human body, I think it's 7 times that we completely go through all the material that we had, or something along that lines. But, we look at something, we say it's a table, it's a dead thing, it's not, incorporating anything new, it's not complicated like life. But even that is having interactions around it, and atoms are joining it and atoms are leaving it. And none of that seems, none of that is apparent to our sort of coarse observations that we naturally make. And on a very similar basis, no matter what we're measuring and using as tools to observe with, it seems that there's no limit to how far down it goes, that there's always something that's just out of reach, okay? Now that fits nicely with the ignorance thing, but so why do I say that science has a dogma? So beyond the observable world, extended by all our tools and whatnot, reflect some sort of reality. And it's a perfectly reasonable way to look at things, it's what we're designed for, essentially, but I would argue that it is, if you don't want to use the term dogma, I would say it's part of the creed of scientism, then. And then you could say, okay, outside of that creed, or essentially axioms upon which, the equivalent of axioms, because there are no axioms in the natural world, right? Another one is that there are fixed natural laws, right, that are kind of always always functioning, It's not like speed of light, it's not only smart, it's the right thing to do. No, you just, the way we look at it, you can't exceed it, period, right? That's what our observations, etc., have brought to us, and thought experiments. when we start saying, look, we've observed these things, we see these laws of nature, and yes, they may be subject to change as not that the laws are changing, but that our understanding of them is imperfect, and that we have to change our understanding to fit, and so that, you know, Newtonian physics, evolves into other forms. Well, yes, but are we absolutely certain? Do we have any reason to believe that these have always acted the way that they have? Well, we have records and whatnot that we can go back and look at. But what if our records are wrong? What if our memory is wrong? And this is kind of one of the things I've talked about, I think, at various times. I don't know if I ever made a video on them, but about shifts, right? Which rational me says, these are figments of my twisted brain. They're fairly common, though. They went through a whole bunch of things that are like, everybody remembers this, but it's wrong, and you can look back and you can say, and it's just like, okay, but why? The Mandela effect, I think it's called. A large percentage of people seem to think that Nelson Mandela died in prison in like the 80s. They're thinking about Stephen Biko, but whatever. And just conflating the two. I've had situations where buildings have disappeared, not right in front of my eyes, but they're no longer where they used to be, that I remember, and then I walk by them again and they're back. And that's one of the evidences of shifts. I've had coinage that has like appeared out of nowhere or disappeared. I don't remember which way it was. And shit like that. And we know that human mind and memory is imperfect, but maybe that's not the case. Maybe our minds and memories are correct, and that it's that reality is mutable in a sense that, like, things that we see as laws are not. And honestly, it's almost it's of the same kind of nature, it feels, as as the kind of as the kind of stuff science can't even talk about. Like, people try to use scientific methods to prove or disprove ghosts. You can't really disprove them, but nobody's able to prove them, and almost everything that gets enough scrutiny is shown to either be a hoax or, some other artifact. And likewise, the question, is there a God, is there not? Another element of the creed, as I would say, of science, is that knowledge is overall a good thing, that we should try to assemble knowledge, that collecting it up is a useful or good process to some degree or not other. And obviously, we can look at, hey, our lives are better than they used to be. All these technological improvements, etc., have been very, very valuable to us, and we've extended our lifespan and everything. Of course, taking away the shifts, where maybe everything was fine and dandy before when the fairies ruled. But yeah, if you want to believe X is good, and then the lack of X is not good, maybe even as evil if you want to be a Thomist about, the definition of evil, then, it seems a reasonable assumption. But then again, so do other things that religion does definitely speak out on very clearly. So like, or at least moral systems do. Theft is evil, murder is evil. Maybe happiness is good. There's no reason to believe these things. Biology, for example, doesn't give a shit about happiness, right? Only to the extent that it promotes passing your genes on, right? Before they wear out. Likewise, murder and theft, well, those are both biologically valuable things to do, right? There's a reason hyenas are chased off by the lion from their kill and then have to come back and then get mocked for, being scavengers. Okay, it's not like lions don't kill too, but, it's often easier to chase off the pack of hyenas that brought something down. What is bad about things like murder and theft is that they're anti-societal. A society that involves, as much murder and theft as you could see, or as you could imagine, is going to break, is just not going to form. It's not going to be created. You have to have some kind of connection for something to allow the society to exist. And so it is sort of a societal imposition, which I'm not going to deny happens in the animal world as well. There are, there are structures and societal structures that allow them to cooperate and coexist in ways that are good overall for their biology, right? And you can make an argument that, well, our exploration of science is allowing us to live longer. Well, that doesn't really fucking matter as long as, cockroaches have been around forever, right? We haven't. Cockroaches don't really live very long. So a long lifespan is not necessarily all that advantageous for the species, and it may not be advantageous for the society as a whole, for a society either. In fact, it may be inhibitory in the sense that you're not being able to evolve as quickly if you're under, if you have an exceedingly long lifespan, and that probably will lower your birth rate, or at least the survivable birth rate. So there may be strong arguments against a long lifespan, right? So the things that we view as good and evil are really baked into what I would say are these societal myths that essentially are what this author defines. I wish I had the definition in front of me. What do we have here? I think it's earlier. Maybe not. Okay. What essentially, seem to drive and create these ideological frameworks. And the societies, the ideologies that are stronger that help, well, they don't even, here's the weird thing, they don't even have to help their genetic inhabitants to survive. It's just the society itself as a structure, or the ideology itself as a structure, or what have to survive. It's almost like they have the same kind of imperative that a biology would, that genetics and evolution entail, which is that the ones that succeed are the ones that are still here. Duh, seems pretty obvious to us now. They're not necessarily the best. They're the best at facing the current context. I gotta swap batteries. It's not exactly a trivial task with the tripod, but I'm getting better at it. And no, this is not why I don't use tripods when gaming. I just can't. I can't cope with them. Okay. Is there anything else that's similar? So again, his defense is that there's no dogma. And again, I'm willing to concede that and say, okay, but you're making what amounts to a rather minor point, right? You're worrying about the semantics of the word dogma in that case, when there's something that's even more important than dogma, which is underlying all of science. Ideas like non-reproducibility, ideas like that knowledge is good, that the non-reproducibility is basically a corollary of the idea that the natural laws and order of things is a constant fixed value throughout, all of eternity, essentially. And that some grand formula can capture everything eventually. We just don't know it. Beyond that, he goes into talking about knowledge as power. That's the my God is better than yours when it comes down to it. My God is better in this context than yours. And, it worked for Christians when they were converting by the sword. It works here when we're converting with, look, if you don't believe in this, that's fine, but we're going to be able to overcome you, with our better equipment, as it were. He doesn't, at least not that I noticed. I mean, he touches vaguely on the idea of sort of the way the nations and the big empires and whatnot essentially fund the majority of scientific research. There's two basic driving forces. Capitalism, which he seems, I'm not absolutely certain, he didn't point it out either. He seems to see that as more of an ideology. I'm saying that because he picks socialism as an ideology, right? In a lot of ways, they both have really deep roots, right? Socialism may be more than capitalism does, because in its essence, socialism is based on empathy, and empathy is absolutely vital for any of our societies to work. Capitalism is based on this capitalism is based on transferable wealth, I guess, and an equivalence matrix. or measure. So you kind of need money for capitalism to work. But as soon as you have money, capitalism is going to erupt, right? And I don't care what else you have in your world. The communist world had capitalism going on in it. The black market worked on capitalistic principles. No matter what you try to do, as soon as you start giving people something that has an intrinsic value based only on its, well, that has value based only on its social acceptance, I think you end up with some form of capitalism just happening. It won't be what we have now, right? But it also, the fact that you can store your wealth as something that is that's not going to just deteriorate and that's not useful in and of itself, I think more or less guarantees that you're going to start forming some kind of capitalism. And long before any kind of capitalist theory or whatever, you certainly have, you look at the Romans and they dealt in ways that seem very much like capitalists today would, right? But they didn't invent some of the cool tools that we have, like the idea of an extra human corporate entity, which should be treated kind of like a human in some ways, but not in others. But when we look at, I'm sorry, I have a bird here that is watching. I think it's a robin. I can't really tell what that is. But I think he's got something hanging out of his beak. Actually, I think it's a she, very dull colored. When you look at, I'm trying to regain my choo-choo here. Yeah, when you look at how science is done today, one of the arguments people, I'm trying to find a better tack to get at the subject that I'm looking at. One of the subjects that people, or one of the ways that people argue in favor of science is, look, you can figure it out for yourself, right? You can do the experiment yourself. Now that may have been true in the 18th century. But since then, certainly within the 20th century and beyond, it's become increasingly less and less possible to do the vast majority of real science, well, especially non-theoretical, but for the observations, for being able to demonstrate. If you pick up somebody's paper and read it and try to reproduce it, what you find is, it takes a lot of money to do that, right? It takes a lot of specialized knowledge as well. We don't have a lot of Ben Franklins out there today. People point to somebody like Elon Musk. Elon Musk has basically almost no knowledge of science. Once upon a time, he knew a little bit about programming. But for the most part, he's an entrepreneur in the real meaning of the term. You hear people throwing it around for like some guy who has a food cart. I'm like, no, that's a business owner. That's a shop owner. Okay, he's an entrepreneur who, you know, through his capabilities and whatever, picked a lot of winners, and there's no indication that his coding skills, even, which were the closest thing he came to science, was more of a craftsman than anything else, were particularly good. You know, no, he's an entrepreneur who has, you know, a high charisma and capability to, like, you know, arrange the funding and everything, and has made some really good bets and a few really bad ones, and that's it, you know. And that's what the majority of the people that we actually look at and say, oh, you know, look at these great innovators and whatever. They may have had a good idea. I wouldn't really say that Musk is a good choice of that, because he wasn't the first person to have the idea of an electronic payment system, and his was not necessarily, well, the one he was involved in at first was not necessarily the best, although it ended up merging into the one that succeeded. But for the most part, it's people who manage to manage other people who maybe have better skills, right? It's very seldom that a truly, you know, that you have a truly skilled innovator who does tremendously well in that kind of position. And beyond that one move, everything else has been financial games. It really has. It's been venture capitalism. And that's what I would look at him as. He's a venture capitalist more than anything else. One who doesn't just take a back seat, but insists on you know, putting his own management in place. Bezos is probably a little more impressive in terms of, like, let's sell books online. Everything else after that, you know, big ideas, we all have big ideas. How many of us actually make them happen? That's something different than having the idea, right? And that's something very, very different than being able to actually build out the technology for it. Bill Gates, same kind of stuff. Steve Jobs, again, more a salesman than anything else when it comes down to it. A salesman and an entrepreneur. Wozniak, probably more of an engineer, but I'm sure became much, much less of one as time went on. So, yeah, this society doesn't really reward the pure engineer. It doesn't really reward a lot of sort of the best at what they do. You have to be the best at getting money, is what you have to be best at, really. And often that involves conning people, and conning in the sense of convincing. That's where conning comes from, right? And then, you know, you happen to have fallen on a good idea that you conned people into, and then that's the differentiation between, like, you know, a failed business and a successful one. You don't even get to start a business if you can't con some people. Not a, you know. So where are we? Yeah. So science, as it's done today, has almost a priesthood. And it has this huge infrastructure, societal infrastructure built around it, in much the way that organized religions do. Are there people who can go outside that? Yeah, yeah. It still is willing to allow, you know, for the holy hermit or whatever you want to make the equivalent there for. But that's why I say it's very, very similar. The structures are similar. The organization is similar. You could make the same argument that governments are also similarly organized. You know, you put a charismatic leader in the front, the real work is being done by the bureaucracy. Is there any reason the people we elect, do they have any particular skills? Yeah, they have the skill of selling themselves. The same skill that the entrepreneur has, essentially, selling themselves, selling an idea. What they don't have is probably, I'm trying to think, but I think in almost all modern cases, go back a couple hundred years, I don't know. I just don't know. You know, I mean, I know the history, but I don't know the reality of it, you see. You know, was Thomas Jefferson, one can argue Ben Franklin probably was a pretty clever dude in a lot of ways. But was Thomas Jefferson really that innovative? You start looking at his stuff, and it was really based on other people who didn't, you know, rise to any kind of great power. They may have risen to fame, although one can question that as well. Even like Newton, besides inventing the Fig Newton bar, no, you know, there's a lot of, you know, you even go back there, that's what, 17th century. You go back there and there's a lot of politics and a lot of skullduggery going on in science in that period as to who gets credit for something, who's known for it. I was watching something on Tycho Brahe recently where he refused to give his his great student is Copernicus, who was kind of his apprentice at one point. And he refused to let Copernicus have access to like his information on Mars. Maybe because he had some intention of his own on it, but you know, not the free interchange of information that we kind of idealize or whatever. I'm gonna swap again. That free exchange of information and everything, that again, that's also part of, you know, call it dogma, call it creed, credo. That's part of what, you know, science is kind of built on. The idea that you make the knowledge available so other people can build up further on it. And that's a good because there's an overall good already assigned there. None of that, though, you know, really gets to there's so the thing is, the things that science is built on are, I think, outside of the realm of science. These axioms of science, I like to call them. I think they're outside of what science can even try to examine. Now, sometimes you see it. So uncertainty principle, that's getting at the edges of, hey, you know, we can't predict and know everything, right? In the real world, there are things that we cannot know. Much more elegant, at least in my opinion, but maybe because I sort of get it, is Gödel's incompleteness theorem. The interesting thing about that is that, yeah, the incompleteness theorem is great with the mathematics that we use, and that is functional in our world. But what if what if there is no infinity, right? It's a useful concept, but there's no indication that there's any reality to it, right? Physicists tend to say the universe is finite but very large. That seems to be the most accepted belief there. Well, if the universe is finite, then the concept of infinity, while it may be useful for things like calculus, in and of itself is actually, a falsehood, right? It's a useful tool for our models, but it doesn't actually mean anything. And the same thing, with the idea of infinitely dividing the number line or something along those lines. That it may not actually, there may be nothing that represents this in reality. Which means that the mathematics upon which all of our science and technology rests is a lie and doesn't represent the reality. And therefore we're kind of stumbling around trying to get an idea, but we're using the wrong senses to do it. Like, instead of looking to see if there's a table in front of you or tapping to see if there's a table in front of you, instead you're listening to the echoes of a bat that's somewhere in the room, or some kind of weird analogy like that. It's what the Wodka does to me. But that's really kind of at the heart of the whole thing, is the fact that the very core tools that we use as the basis of our science, the mathematics we use, and mathematics that includes infinity, and includes dividing things. You don't have Zeno's paradox if you can't divide things infinitely small, right? If everything breaks down eventually to a finite space, if there is in the Greek way, an atom, if there is a smallest, not just measurable, but smallest existential distance, and everything is broken into those, what would that mean for our science? Obviously, our approximations are great for everything we deal in, but it's interesting to think about, because the idea that everything is infinitely divisible is not at all showable, no matter how far we divide things, right? And when you start looking at things like quantum physics, you start saying that the underlying is so fucking different from what our conceptualization of reality is, that I'm not sure that there's any reason to believe any of our conceptualizations of reality, as it were. Which is to say, we see a distance, we say it's a foot between me, it's 2 feet between me and the camera. Well, I can divide that in half, that's a foot. I can divide that in half, that's 6 inches. I divide that in half, and so on and so on and so on. But at some point, maybe I can't divide it in half anymore. And maybe we need that mathematics instead. And at some point we may find that we need that, so that's not really a great example of something that would be completely obscured to us. It is now, if that's the case. But it would seem rather strange if the universe is finite that subdivisions within the universe would not also be finite. Functionally, they are. Both cases, right? Like, we know that there are stars we can't see, but we don't know what the limit is to that. And now, that all gets blown to shit if you say the universe is just a bubble among many universes, which is another theory, right? There's a whole bunch of these sort of, I'm not going to say out there, but sort of unknowable type things that science kind of speculates on, which is kind of weird because science refuses nowadays to even address certain issues, like the laws of physics change every now and then. You know, I don't know. I think I'm running down on this, so I guess I'll load this up. But I just wanted to, you know, it's kind of funny. These aren't. Somebody mistook my scientism for the author's words. This has nothing to do with this. These sub-book discussions that I'm making, these are just thoughts that I'm having that I feel like I need to express, and they're being triggered by this book, not actually stuff contained within it. I do try to work directly from it when I want to bring something up, like, you know, the point that he says science has no dogma. Well, I don't know. What do you want to define dogma as, right? You know, is the Trinity Christian dogma, or is that creed? Because, oh boy, do I have problems with that, man. All right, time for a tangent. Let's end this on a tangent, unless I don't end it. I had a guy I used to work with. Never would have guessed. He was a security guard. Italian heritage, so I would have guessed he was Catholic. Turns out no. He was some sort of Protestant evangelical faith. And so I asked him, you know, we had gotten to discussing religion rather than porno mags or something along those lines. Or weird people who walked through the garage. I asked him, you know, are Catholics Christian? He says, I guess. Anybody who believes, you know, in Jesus and the Trinity. And I sort of slumped back. I'm like, wow. The Trinity is one of the weirdest things. And I still don't understand why it is that evangelicals and Protestants hold to it. Because there's absolutely no evidence for this bullshit in the Bible. You know? This is... trying to remember what it is. It's a Neoplatonic idea. Completely, you know, a-religious stuff. Just, you know, pure philosophy type stuff that somehow got welded onto Christianity. And it's just so fucking weird to me that would be a big deal. Now, I don't know what Christian sects, what people who consider themselves Christian, organized, who don't believe in the Trinity, but it just struck me as so fucking weird. But I would say that's part of the creed, you know? And the dogma, I mean, how would you differentiate the two? Like, they seem like such similar things. We believe X. you know, I wouldn't say that the sun goes around the earth as part of Christian dogma at any time. It was habit, to believe that all the heavens rotated around the earth. A habit based on this vague idea that we're important or something, right? But, after killing a few dozen people for, and imprisoning others like Galileo, Christianity more or less said, okay, whatever, what would be dogma? I guess the Immaculate Conception? Because that's not, like, if you want to differentiate between the credo and the dogma, the credo is very, very limited. But you don't get Immaculate Conception from the credo. It's not like it's a progression from the axioms or anything like that. So it feels kind of like, we believe this because the Pope said it, or whatever. But whereas it is in the Bible. So here's what's weird. So I think he's taking dogma as everything. I really do. And I think that's where he's mistaken. Because I think that what I call scientism is absolutely reliant. And it's kind of interesting. Sometimes I play games, right? Not the ones that you usually watch, but with words and whatnot. So I'm like, I'll eventually drag out, look, the way that the scientific, the academic establishment is set up, creates a sort of a dogma. But, it's mutable. But I gotta say, most religions are mutable at that same level too, right? They just use a different source material. Instead of, we made observations of the natural world, therefore we determine X, they're looking and saying, we made observations in the religious texts, and you might get a schism from this or whatever, but we made observations from the religious text, and we see X. They're discussing different things, though, right? Like you might be talking about the nature of evil, or you might be talking about whether or not purgatory actually exists, or shit like that. It's really interesting because one of my viewers actually pointed this one out, but obviously I mentioned the parallelism between, like, the Trinity and a more pagan or I can't remember the right word for it, but a multiple gods situation. I don't know how much one, Jesus never said, I too am God, or I am my Father and I am the Word. Never said anything fucking close to that. Maybe there's something like it in John, but John is so late. It's already heavily influenced by external forces, no matter whether you believe in the existence of Jesus or not. He always referred to it as my Father. He was the Son of God or something, and it's just so weird how we've elevated that. He sort of comes down, well, he sort of is portrayed as acting like more like a prophet, but one with a familial connection, you know? The ultimate Nepo baby. Unlike, say, Muhammad, who's just like, you know, dude sent one of his lackeys down to talk to me, and yeah, I'm telling you what he told me. You know? Or the earlier prophets who were like, God himself spoke to me. It's kind of funny. It's like, I don't know. I guess Jesus' Nepo baby situation is a little bit closer than, you know, what the earlier prophets. The earlier prophets are all like, God took me to heaven, showed me this. But it's kind of in order. It's like, obviously, Jesus, the closest. You know, he's God's little brat. Came down here, just like Lachlan Murdoch, and taking charge, right? Yeah, I'm watching or I just watched some documentaries on Lachlan Murdoch. You get all kind of crap here. So he's kind of at the highest level. Well, no, it's weird because the earliest were like, I am God. Right? I think, you know, when you get to the pharaohs and whatnot, it's more like, kind of like Jesus. I'm a descendant of God, of gods, and therefore I am a god myself. And, you know, you get that through the Romans even. The emperors started, you know, Caesar, Kaiser, put the Julian family as descended from Venus, I think, essentially. But it's kind of weird because Jesus, if you take him for his word, seems like a throwback to an older flavor. But when you look at the Israelite prophets, they were taken or shown or told something by God. And then you jump to Muhammad and it's like, yeah, God didn't even tell me. He just sent somebody to tell me. And therefore, I'm the final prophet. Actually, he doesn't even say that, as far as I'm aware. That's just, you know, what's been decided or whatever. But, and then of course we get even further what's his name? John Smith? The Mormon. It's not Brigham Young, is it? He was like the governor. Like he outlived. I don't know. But, you know, yeah. Something told me to go dig up these plates, and I read all this shit in them. It's getting really, I don't know where it's going to go, you know? Feels like it's getting more and more believable, in a way. Maybe that's the point, but I mean, who's the least believable of them all? I'm the son of God. You're God! No. Someday I have to get into my individuation theories and put them on video too. I don't think this book's going to help me with that. All right, I'll pick up.